Okay, we are online on YouTube now, and good morning and afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This is a continuation of our Wisdom Path colloquia that I do periodically with my colleague Tim Holmes. And today our guest is Dr. Maram, who is that correctly pronounced?
Just Maram.
Maram, okay. Dr. Maram, who is the author of the Schizophrenia Complex. And normally we do not handle clinical issues in this program, but Dr. Maram's work crosses over to the civilian side, and therefore I felt the need to include it in this series. So Eve, thank you very much for being here. You can go ahead.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure to be here. Just checking in with you. I have the time as like 11:01. Do you want to?
You might want to wait your presentation for a couple more minutes because people are often
Sure.
a little late coming in, and
that's good. Well, I have an idea. Why don't I try the screen share thing we've talked about and hope it works, and then
okay, go ahead.
That'll give us some time to play with that. Okay. Whoop, I have to go back here. There we go. Okay. I don't know what you're seeing. I only know what I think you're seeing. So is what you're seeing a slide?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Okay. And you see the schizophrenia complex feeling our way to a new attitude?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I know what else I need to.
Okay, we have 22 participants at this time, and so why don't you go ahead? We also have 7 people watching on YouTube as of now. Great. And usually that builds. I'll keep track of those results as they advance so that you have a sense of how many people were here. But why don't you go ahead?
Okay. I'm going to try and click what I need to in order. I have a very brief video clip, and so I'm hoping that that will work. Okay. Well, first of all, thank all of you for being here. This is not an easy topic. I appreciate what Skip said about this writing and my emphasis being inclusive in terms of it. It's definitely not just for Jungian or academic purposes. And in fact, the genesis of it was personal as much as clinical. I am having a little weird thing happen with my screen here, but hopefully that will resolve itself. Every time I've been talking about this, I realize that I find myself entering what I'm describing as the schizophrenia complex, which has to do with the thoughts and feelings that are generated by any encounter with schizophrenia. For reasons that I will explore with you a little bit later, it was a topic that I was drafted into. by circumstances in my life. And I would call it the will of psyche, because otherwise I would not have chosen it. So when I get ready to talk about it, I find myself feeling a lot of resistance. I know it's a hard topic. And that's the reason for my giving this PowerPoint the title that I did, Feeling Our Way to a New Attitude, because the reason that I wrote the book is in hopes that by talking about the thoughts and feelings that are generated by an encounter with what we call schizophrenia, which is many different things, by the way, I can help in some small way to shift attitudes toward curiosity, inclusion, and openness. So more to come. I will say, I have a friend who is not in the field of psychology, who I gave this book to. I've known her for a million years. And initially she was very resistant, did not want to, couldn't get into it. As I said, she's not in the field of psychology or particularly familiar with Jung. And she said, there's just way too many terms. It's too clinical. And I can't get into it. And it's a difficult subject. Okay. So then, and I didn't bring it up again, a little while later, she said that she'd continued reading. And she said, I noticed something shifted. I was out in the community and I was walking around. I saw a woman who was demonstrating what we could clearly identify as psychosis. She was probably schizophrenic. And my friend said that whereas initially and previously, what she would have done is probably avoided, gone to the other side of the street, and had automatic response of aversion, that instead some of what she had been reading had filtered in, and she said to herself, well, maybe that woman is having an encounter with her unconscious. And just that little difference in terms of how we respond. And our responses are usually automatic, but if we can get a little breath in there between our automatic and considering a new attitude, then that's what I hope for. So what I will do is go through the presentation that I have, and it's on the PowerPoint. Part of it will be on the PowerPoint. A lot of it is framed in the PowerPoint. But as we go along, I will be reading briefly from the book, The Schizophrenia Complex. And often these excerpts are on the PowerPoint, so I apologize in advance for it feels weird when you're watching a PowerPoint and then somebody reads it aloud. At least that's how I feel. So I'm doing that because my hope is that the PowerPoint will somehow amplify what I am saying aloud. So I know you can all read. At the end, there will certainly be time for questions and dialogue. So again, thank you all very much for being here. This is a hard topic, and I am honored that you chose to join me, allowed me to join you this morning. I guess it's afternoon for most of you. Okay, so why this book? Well, as many things in life, I was going to say Jungian, but it's not just Jungian. There may be a dream. And in this case, I did have a dream. I call it my sinkhole dream. This happened, now it's been probably 9.5 years ago. So I'm going to go ahead and read from the book. I had a dream that I was reminded of as I began the book on the schizophrenia complex that I put off writing for so long. Here's the dream. I was alone in an underground area of a large, unfamiliar building, maybe a YMCA, needing to complete my workout by diving into a small, round, rimmed pool of cold, dark water in the center of a small, windowless, dimly lit room. I was anxious and torn, as I felt that in order to complete what I expected of myself, I needed to dive in and start swimming, but the prospect was terrifying. Even in the dream, although I couldn't bring myself to actually take the plunge, I could vividly imagine what it would be like to be swimming tight laps in this narrow, black, seemingly bottomless sinkhole, far from the light of day, alone and claustrophobic. At the time, upon reflection, I worried that this dream implied I was less open to my unconscious than I prided myself on being as a good Jungian. What I perceive now is that this was a necessarily unsettling prospective message from my own depths, something far from my conscious attitude and certainly not arriving by choice. That was March, and on July 2nd, my adult son had an unexpected psychotic break, leaving the rest of us metaphorically doing laps in the darkness, trying to get back on solid ground. In the years since, my journey has involved developing a relationship with schizophrenia and our complexes around it, first through my son, who has blessedly returned from the unreachable depths, and then more recently, as we have all had some time to breathe, through the rest of our family, all of whom love him and are so deeply affected by his trajectory. It is the feeling dimension of this experience which constitutes my focus here. My son did not undergo his deep dive alone. The feelings associated with his journey continue to impact our lives, along with the unsolicited onus of trying to shift forever an unbidden hereditary burden, the previously unspoken complex in our family, generated by the experience of having a family member with schizophrenia. On some level, which I explain more about later, that complex affects families for generations, both literally and psychically. And what I'm referring to is that along with what happened with my son, it came to light in ways I had certainly been unaware of before, that on my mother's side of the family, there was a relative who had schizophrenia, and the response of that generation and that family was one of the reasons I felt motivated to lean into the possibility of another attitude. Okay. And those are, that gives you an idea of the family events that were involved in this project. My Jungian studies also, and as I'm pretty sure most of you are very familiar with, Jung's work with schizophrenia was absolutely instrumental in terms of the development of so many of his just fundamental concepts, the ideas that he contributed, and I'll talk a little bit more about that today, and it certainly is in the book. So as I mentioned, the emergence of an unavoidable topic, not one I would have chosen to swim with if I had had a choice. I think this quote, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is very relevant here. Jung's relationship with madness in general, in specific, was inspiring to me, as it has been, I know, to so many. He opened us up in terms of how we might relate to this archetypal phenomenon, aka the unconscious. So I'm going to read it if you'll bear with me. This is, of course, from the Red Book. Be silent and listen. Have you recognized your madness, and do you admit it? Have you noticed that all your foundations are completely mired in madness? Do you not want to recognize your madness and welcome it in a friendly manner? You wanted to accept everything, so accept madness too. Let the light of your madness shine, and it will suddenly dawn on you. Madness is not to be despised and not to be feared, but instead you should give it life. If you want to find paths, you should also not spurn madness, since it makes up such a great part of your nature. Be glad that you can recognize it, for you will thus avoid becoming its victim. Madness is a special form of the spirit and clings to all teachings and philosophies, but even more to daily life, since life itself is full of craziness and at bottom utterly illogical. Man strives toward reason only so that he can make rules for himself. Life itself has no rules. That is its mystery and its unknown law. What you call knowledge is an attempt to impose something comprehensible on life. Okay, and here we are, a little discussion of complex, which again, I suspect is a familiar concept to most of you. Jung talked about a schizophrenia complex in a different way than he talked about other feeling-toned complexes. That's not my approach. So I have a different definition of a schizophrenia complex than he does. And next, I talk more about that, certainly in the book, and I'll mention it again today with you. So a complex is an emotionally charged knot of largely unconscious feelings and beliefs with a powerful influence on perceptions and behaviors. I like to think of it as a pod, like a little round presence inside us, in our psychic life. A pod of feeling-toned ideas or images that accumulate around certain archetypes, meaning unconscious, universally inherited human patterns of thought or behavior, literal, symbolic, and psychic. At its core, the complex occurs in response to an experience that is in some way archetypal, larger than life. When complexes are constellated, they are invariably accompanied by affect and remain relatively autonomous. They have a life of their own. Jung says that a complex, quote unquote, is the image of a certain psychic situation which is strongly accentuated emotionally and is incompatible with a habitual attitude of consciousness. The schizophrenia complex, as I conceptualize it, is not the phenomenon of schizophrenia itself viewed as a complex, but concerns the emotionally charged thoughts and feelings generated in response to the schizophrenic condition. The archetypal core of such a feeling-toned complex might be the image of chaos. In 2016, well before I was working on the current book, I wrote an article for Psychological Perspectives, the journal of the LA Jung Institute, called Dialoguing with My Demon. At the time, I was hoping that this article would represent all I would need to do to write about this topic, and I was wrong. But there is a section in this article I would like to share with you because I think it speaks to the image of what this is in terms of our encounters, begins to. I have come to perceive schizophrenia as less about a split mind, as the etymology suggests, than an unruly expanded one. The visions and dreams, the lack of differentiation between the dream world and the waking one that characterize schizophrenia, reflect the diffused vastness of the unconscious, unfettered by the constraints and the organizing functions of consciousness. The unconscious as a construct both repels and lures us. Schizophrenia generally just repels us. It represents unconsciousness, unbounded, lost in space, a separation of the mind while the body is eerily still before us, staring at or through us from that other intangible dimension on the street corner, strolling lopsidedly down Venice Beach, sleeping, that's in California, talk more about that later, sleeping on cardboard, in the hospital waiting room, the therapy office, or our living room. Who would face or even visit such a monster voluntarily? After all, that monster represents the aspects of ourselves we would most like to avoid, our own capacity for madness, the mad state of our limited existence, the universal human reality of our eventual absorption into death, the great unsolvable mystery of our very being. I speak a little bit about the clinical piece here, and I talk in the book about doing treatment. I mention a lot of different perspectives on this phenomenon, but always the reason for all of these, setting the context is just that it's context. And my focus is how does this affect the complexes that we experience in an encounter with all the many things we call schizophrenia. We really don't know what it is. Schizophrenia is described in current clinical psychiatry as a constellation of signs and symptoms that may include hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, and grossly disorganized or abnormal motor behavior, including catatonia. These are referred to as positive symptoms because they are feelings and behaviors that are overt, observable, and atypical of the individual's normal functioning. The condition also includes negative symptoms that represent a reduction or loss of normal functioning in some way. Blunting of affect, poverty of speech and thought, apathy, anhedonia, joylessness, lack of social drive or interest, avolition, lost motivation, and inattention to input from the external world. Several generally recognized subtypes of schizophrenia, and this was the DSM, as I'm thinking most of you, many of you are already familiar, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and they keep coming up with different versions. The most recent is the DSM-5 TR, meaning text revised. It doesn't include these subtypes, but I find them helpful just in terms of how we discuss the many different ways that what we call schizophrenia may show up. And back in the DSM-4 TR, these were included. And they are paranoid, catatonic, and undifferentiated or hebephrenic, which is the childlike version. Quite different. Some types of symptoms show more than others, but a commonality is the inner chaos experienced by someone with an ego submerged in the unconscious. And if you walk away from this podcast today with an image, I hope that includes that piece, is this idea that we all need our egos to function. We all have an unconscious, and the relationship between those two has a great deal to do with how we navigate the world. And for someone who is experiencing what we call schizophrenia, it can be imagined as an ego that is fully submerged in the unconscious, or certainly more than is necessary for the ego to help ground in the world. And Edinger has a wonderful illustration of that we'll talk about later also. Okay. One way that the chaos of this experience manifests is in the form of unregulated affect or behavior that may be extroverted, it may be introverted, or it may be both. This characteristic is particularly relevant to the schizophrenia complex, since it's usually the odd behavior reflective of inner chaos that triggers a strong emotional response in those who encounter it. Our relationship with our inner madness, with the unconscious, has everything to do with what schizophrenia means in our culture and in our psyches, both personal and collective. Individually and collectively, our avoidance of this aspect of human existence is significant. Fear, avoidance, and blind hatred, othering, create a marginalization that damages at least as deeply as a scattered mind, if not more so. The schizophrenia complex is both intimately subjective and archetypal, affecting everyone differently. The experience of all we mean by schizophrenia and our encounters with it can be conceptualized, as I was just saying, as the ego's submergence in the unconscious. The schizophrenia complex can be understood in terms of a profound ripple effect from the personal to the collective, the numinous, and the symbolic. And aren't all those layers constantly involved in our experience? And this illustration that I hope you're seeing on the PowerPoint here is the one I was referring to previously from Edinger, Ego and Archetypes, on page 5. He talks about this illustration serves slightly different function in terms of what how he uses it, but I find it beautifully illustrates my idea about the ego's submergence in the unconscious. So here we go, differences, and there are many, between Jung's definition of a schizophrenia complex and mine, although there's a lot of overlap as well. As Jungian analyst Daryl Sharp explained, Jung believed that many psychoses, and particularly schizophrenia, were psychogenic, resulting from an abaissement du niveau mental, French, a lowering of consciousness, and an ego, here we go again, too weak to resist the onslaught of unconscious contents. The complex of an individual with schizophrenia, as Jung described it, is radically dissociated from any unifying personality, a split that reaches the organic structure of the individual. This condition differs from Jung's definition of a complex in general as feeling toned. Jung seemed to refer to a schizophrenia complex as the state of schizophrenia itself within an individual bearing its symptoms, rather than an emotional reaction to the condition itself involving unresolved feelings and beliefs. One way this difference is evident between Jung's definition and mine is that my definition of a schizophrenia complex means that individuals who have experienced what we call schizophrenia can also have a schizophrenia complex once they have recovered enough ego stability and affect to realize how they're being responded to and have an emotional reaction to it. Realize, think about, feel what they've been through. Okay. Okay. This is a quote from Jung's definition of a complex in general as feeling toned. It is the image of a certain situation which is strongly accentuated emotionally and is, moreover, incompatible with the habitual attitude of consciousness. This image has a powerful inner coherence. It has its own wholeness, and in addition, a relatively high degree of autonomy, so that it is subject to the control of the conscious mind to only a limited extent, and therefore behaves like an animated foreign body in the sphere of consciousness. That is, whereas he describes most complexes as knots of incompatible emotions that differ from one's ego-syntonic persona, how we present ourselves in the world, relatively unconscious but accessible to ego consciousness. His definition of a schizophrenia complex is qualitatively different in its characteristic of extreme dissociation from ego consciousness. I fought with myself about whether to include this in this presentation because it's a bit of an amplification of the ideas I've been saying most recently about the difference between Jung's definition and mine. But I think it's interesting, and we'll just drop it in here, and it is discussed further in the book. So Eros Shalit, late Jungian analyst, discussed the complex as having a task. I think that's an interesting concept, to serve as a vehicle and a vessel for transformation, whereby the archetypal essence is brought into living reality. In someone with a strong enough ego, this process can occur fairly readily. The complexes enable a relatively smooth transition from the archetypal to the personal. However, for somebody in a psychotic state, archetypal contents flood the ego to such an extent that the vessel of transformation cannot hold. It can't serve its purpose. As illustration, Shalit referred to Jung's distinction between soul complexes and spirit complexes. The former being more like a regular feeling tone complex, and the latter being more like Jung's description of a schizophrenia complex, i.e., radically disconnected from ego consciousness. Jung compared the experience of these two kinds of complexes with the primitive belief in souls and spirits. Souls correspond to the autonomous complexes of the personal unconscious, and spirits to those of the collective unconscious. Bigger, wilder, and more inaccessible. Thus, soul complexes are essentially useful to the individual's developing sense of identity, since they can be assimilated into consciousness, whereas spirit complexes are associated with psychosis, with an ego too weak to withstand the archetypal world, and so the complex cannot perform its transformative task. This differentiation helps to explain Jung's ideas about the differences between feeling tone complexes, which would be more like soul complexes, and what he calls a schizophrenia complex, a spirit complex. Jung did not discuss complexes that arise in response to encountering schizophrenia in another person, or complexes in people with schizophrenia that are feeling toned and not fully split off. That's where I come in. I don't make the distinction that Jung did between the schizophrenia complex, characteristic of someone with schizophrenia, and the normal or neurotic complexes of others impacted by the condition, which I also refer to as a schizophrenia complex. The barely accessible, unresolved feelings and beliefs that we hold about any encounter with madness, even a personal one, are often at least as devastating a challenge as the experience itself, to ourselves and to others impacted by our attitude. Schizophrenia itself is not a complex, as I'm defining it, which is different from Jung. What we call schizophrenia involves incursions from the unconscious, affective and energetic experience disconnected from consciousness. In contrast, the schizophrenia complex, as I'm describing it, has to do with the thoughts and emotions that arise from a conscious experience of encountering schizophrenia. Thus, the complex can occur in an individual who has suffered psychosis themselves and recovered enough ego consciousness to recall, reflect upon, and retrieve ego-associated affect with some insight. The complex is also triggered in others whose lives are impacted by those who suffer schizophrenia. Training analyst Barry Williams on the potential for something transformative in the undoing of one's life, at least as one has perceived it to be. I heard him say this probably around the time that my son's condition was we were grappling with it. He was based in Santa Fe. He's a Jungian analyst, but he's also trained as a shaman. I found the insight and this, sometimes people share something that is just at the right time. At least I've had that experience in my life. And this, I felt like it was just delivered at a very poignant and impactful time for me. The cure for psychopathology is to unpathologize it. The just so-ness of life is the beauty of it, even if the ego is experiencing it as beautiful or unbearable. There's no increase in consciousness without sacrifice. Sacrifice is part of individuation, and sacrifice is archetypal. You have to go through the undoing of your life in order to have your life. Okay. Islands of clarity. A colleague of mine once used this expression to describe the fact that individuals who are in a psychotic state often will emerge with amazing clarity, spontaneously, intermittently, unprompted. So I'm going to read just a little bit about that concept from the book. Pretty brief. Page 30. An individual caught in the maelstrom of madness may be unaware of their plight while psychotic, but once such a plight becomes conscious, even a glimpse of ordinary reality entails some degree of confrontation with the terror of experiencing extreme alienation. Most individuals with schizophrenia are not in a constant state of psychosis, but emerge periodically, experiencing what a colleague called, quote unquote, islands of clarity. Perhaps in those clear moments, such an individual is most susceptible to what I'm referring to as the schizophrenia complex, as consciousness of the labyrinth in which one is lost means facing both the terrifying raw otherness of one's own inner state and one's standing in the outer world. The resulting anguish is more neurotic than psychotic, a form of ego suffering. We are disturbed by how disturbed we are, rather than being completely lost in the dark without a compass. These islands of clarity represent not only periods of cognitive coherence, but a potential restoration of the affect that was lost during psychosis. When someone in a psychotic state begins to regain their ego, initially they may be able to remember details of the experience they have been through, but the associated affect may still be absent. When such an individual begins to recover their true feelings and emotions about that experience, they may be horrified, saddened, enraged, ashamed, or overwhelmed. In response, they're likely to retreat back into the oblivion of the netherworld, especially if not on medication. I'm going to read a little bit from my son here. I don't know if you're familiar with Venice Beach, but I described it as a cross between Coney Island and Tijuana in the book. It's a raucous blend of artists, performers, so-called homeless people, drug addicts, mentally ill, free-for-all on the beach in California. Okay. And that is where my son took off to when he had his dive. My son told me that when he was on Venice Beach in a psychotic state, he recalled a sense of quote unquote, quote, joy, freedom, independence like I hadn't felt before, open, strong, outgoing, adventurous with my mind. He also described, quote unquote, being nuts, believing wholeheartedly in things that aren't real. I miss it in a way, and I don't. When I was not on meds, I had more energy, but I couldn't live in society. The dream world is fun, but I enjoy having stability. In hindsight, about that period many years later, he reflected, I was in pain the whole time I was in psychosis. He had restored that lost affect to his ego consciousness. I'm using the term schizophrenia complex in a way akin to our typical understanding of a complex as feeling toned, accessible to some ego consciousness, although relatively compartmentalized. Defined thus, the schizophrenia complex in a schizophrenic individual involves that individual's conscious feelings and emotions about his or her psychotic condition. For example, when someone with schizophrenia starts to become aware of being looked at quizzically by others and to feel and express the emotional impact of such observation, there's an opening of sorts. The affect consciously experienced by the individual is then accessible as a feeling toned complex. The associated affect is no longer split off, fully autonomous and compartmentalized from consciousness. As such, to be able to be in a complex is a sign of recovery for someone with schizophrenia. To have a complex requires an ego that is not fully submerged in the unconscious. It requires a degree of consciousness, the ability to reflect and to name affects. I'm giving just a nod to this in this presentation. I talk more about it in the book. I mentioned briefly at the beginning that part of the process of this writing included my becoming aware in a way that I hadn't before, both of the fact that it was my mother's sister had schizophrenia, which was something she kept secret for my entire growing up years, but that the family's attitude had been tremendously impactful in terms of my psychic family legacy. And Jung has many wonderful quotes that talk about this. I picked these two because I think they are particularly relevant to where I'm choosing to focus. Psychologically, the central point of a human personality is the place where the ancestors are reincarnated. And nothing influences children more than the silent facts in the background. It's fascinating to me that even though I had no knowledge about anybody in my extended family having schizophrenia, my mother had cut off contact with her family for that reason. But I didn't know that. And yet this silent background thrum of anxiety around all that secret material is something that I do remember experiencing and could only give language to and come to some understanding about when I was confronted with my own experience of a family member with schizophrenia. Any encounter with schizophrenia carries an invitation to get in touch with our own madness. We would rather refuse if given a choice. An archetypal challenge faces us. Inner-outer conflicts representing chaos and order, the lure of madness and the need for balance. And there are a million references for that story in mythology and fairy tales and throughout history. Talk about a few of them in the book. British author Nathan Filer, mental health nurse, alludes to the incredible impact of schizophrenia, even the word, upon the immediate sufferer, but also the rest of us. Excuse me. He's hopeful that it's possible to have a shift in consciousness around schizophrenia while honoring the archetypal scope of this problem, emphasizing its emotional impact. Excuse me. He writes, "What a word, huh? I wonder if you might consider trying something for me. I won't ask you to do this. For one thing, I wouldn't hear you anyway, but it's something to ponder. Say the word schizophrenia out loud a few times. Not beneath your breath, really say it. Say it loud enough that you feel self-conscious, that you worry someone will hear. Say it loud enough that someone might hear. Feel the shape of it. Stay with it. Think about what that word evokes in you. What thoughts does it arrive with? What feelings? Please remember this as you do so. Whole lives have disappeared beneath that word." And thinking back to my sinkhole dream. Any encounter with, that was, if some of you missed this, they came in later. I had a dream about having to dive into this bottomless hole pit to swim dark in a YMCA, and I definitely did not want to, but felt compelled to do my exercises there, and that was right on the cusp of when my son had his psychotic break several months later. Of course, we did not know that then. And this is, I'm reading a little from the book on page 48. Any encounter with schizophrenia carries an invitation to get in touch with our own madness. We would rather refuse if given a choice. My sinkhole dream, described in the preface, presents just such a justifiable terror. The challenge of diving into that black, bottomless pool is not like walking a child to swim class and encouraging them to be unafraid, coaxing a step toward a positive development. Contrarily, it could represent a psychic dissolution that is not in service to individuation at all, but a leap into nothing for nothing. At least not for a part of our existence we can know or own. Who in their right mind would choose that? In such an instance, wariness is healthy, maybe a healthy defense against being overwhelmed, against the threat of disintegration. The desire to avoid such an experience is reasonable, even self-preserving. It is to be afraid of the loss of our very sense of self. That dive into the bottomless dark waters represents the annihilation of consciousness, of the ego, and the strength we work hard for, need, and count on. We want to stay in that brightly lit room for understandable and legitimate reasons. So in the dream I recounted in the preface, why was I tempted and even cajoled by myself, the dream ego, my inner gym teacher, to dive into the pool and do my exercises while every fiber of my being pulled away from the dreaded task? Perhaps because something in me, in us, does compel us to know more, to bring to consciousness what we can from the seeming black void of the unknown. That inner dialogue does seem in the service of individuation and may in fact be prerequisite. Here we have yet another tension of opposites. That safe, brightly lit room of ego consciousness juxtaposed with the boundless reaches of the dark unconscious. The nature of our human existence inevitably bridges both, and failure to balance the tension between these realities can be mortally destructive. The challenge of navigating these opposites is enough to strike justifiable terror into anyone's heart. Although described as a thought disorder, the lived experience of schizophrenia is mired in the realm of affect, both for those afflicted whose own conscious feeling associations are lost, and for those others affected by their loved one's heartbreaking unavailability. Schizophrenia attacks relatedness through a confluence of factors, including emotional disconnection and the feelings of otherness, shame, and stigma that surround this experience for everyone it touches. I'm going to read a few quotes from my son. They're brief. And this was from a fairly recent reflection from my son. When I was psychotic, I was angry at anyone who came in my way. So my feelings towards you were ultimately defiant. I look back in retrospect and realize it was about having freedom to do what I wanted to do, and I didn't have a liking for rules and discipline. Once I regained some reality to my life, I was calmer and more patient, which in turn gave me the ability to love and care for you and the ones I love. As time went on and I continued to take medication, I began to feel the connection we once had. I would say that respect is the one aspect that's most prevalent with me toward you and the whole family. When I was psychotic, I really didn't think about anybody but myself. That has completely changed as well. I look forward to helping others and you, and also myself. There is positive communication that's caring and understanding, along with being able to sympathize. This is from the book. My son was living an archetypal life. His car was his chariot, and when it was gone, we found it and took it in a failed attempt to get him home. It did not matter. He wandered. He soared with the angels, and when he landed, he was severely sunburned. Echoes of Icarus. The physical injuries he had sustained suddenly came to his conscious attention. Re-entry was slow and painful. To quote him from the arrival side of the gaping brink of his journey. First and most importantly, I had the love and support of my family. I don't know what I would be doing without the love and support of you guys. I put myself in many situations that made me stuck on an island, and you gave me a lifeboat to living. What does reel us back to land from the far reaches of the unconscious? There is no one answer. Perhaps we have to come apart in order to reconstitute the lives we were meant to have, sacrificing the script written by ego, as I was challenged to do, or salvaging an ego flooded by the unconscious, as my son was challenged to do. Sometimes it is love that reels us back. Inevitably, sometimes it is the opposite. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, Jung included the following from Freud's posthumous writings about 2 basic instincts, Eros and death. The aim of Eros is to establish ever greater unities and to preserve them thus, in short, to bind together. The aim of the destructive instinct is, on the contrary, to undo connections and so to destroy things. For this reason, we also call it the death instinct. Jung comments, life, like any other process, has a beginning and an end, and every beginning is also the beginning of the end. What Freud probably means is the essential fact that every process is a phenomenon of energy, and that all energy can proceed only from the tension of opposites. The complicated interplay of energies that resulted in the return of my son to solid ground undoubtedly included both destruction and love. Both were necessary. There was the destruction of the old order of our lives, inner and outer, and the power of love that allowed us to remain connected throughout that arduous journey. Jung's history with schizophrenia, as I mentioned at the beginning, so fundamental to his greatest gifts to us. He did his psychiatric residency living on the 2nd floor of the Burgholzli, the psychiatric hospital in Zurich, under the mentorship of the hospital's director, Eugen Bleuler. That immersive work was what taught Jung about the mythopoetic nature of the unconscious. One defining difference between Freud and Jung was Jung's work with psychotic patients, which opened him to the mystery, chaos, and formlessness of the unconscious. Tremendous courage to delve into this formidable milieu, inner and outer, with curiosity and openness so beyond his time. Eugen Bleuler he did the word association test that you've all heard of, I'm sure. And with Eugen, he developed from Eugen's theories his own with regard to schizophrenia. These two, Eugen Bleuler and Emil Kraepelin, were primary medical model influences in Jung's early time then. Significant is that Emil Kraepelin referred to what we call schizophrenia now as dementia praecox, which basically is a form of early dementia, very different from the way that Jung began to understand what was going on with what we call schizophrenia. Bleuler's approach was a significant departure from Kraepelin's because it opened the possibility that psychotic patients' hallucinations and delusions had meaning and were not simply byproducts of neurological degeneration. And then Jung took this further, bridging the hallucinations of some patients to archetypal themes, which became the genesis of his concept of the collective unconscious, one of the foundational concepts of his work. The case that is most often used and with which we're probably most familiar is that of solar phallus man, when he made that link between the hallucinations and delusions of a psychotic patient and mythopoetic themes. I have this slide on the word association experiments. I don't know how many of you have seen A Dangerous Method, but this is a good, if I can get it to work, this gives you a good example of, I don't know if I can do this. Probably can't. Okay, I'm not gonna. Skip, unless you have some brilliant ideas about how to make this happen. I'm just gonna.
No, I don't, but this is an important film, A Dangerous Method, and I encourage everyone to see it. It's about Freud and Jung before Jung became Jung, actually, and before the Red Book began, so before his major 40 years of writing, but it has a really great scene where it covers the association method.
Yeah.
And it's great to have this list of 100 things.
Yeah. So it was originally called The Talking Cure, and they had to tweak it a little to appeal to the, I think particularly the American audience. They also added some sex that wasn't in the original. So it's another plug for the book, for the film. Okay. But the idea was that it was measuring reaction times to certain words, and from that pause, for example, you could tell that there was something that had been triggered, and that's what led to the kinds of discussion they would have about it and the analysis afterwards. So we have other stuff, mainly about visual reaction time tests that psychologists use in other settings, but it's the same idea. So it was Eugen Bleuler. There shouldn't be an E on that. It's my typo. It's not Eugene, it's Eugen, who figured out the value of applying the study of association patterns, including measures of attention and feeling tone, to psychotic patients in order to examine the inner workings of their condition scientifically. Bleuler's hypothesis opened the possibility that these patients' hallucinations and delusions had meaning and were not simply byproducts of neurological degeneration. Jung took this discovery much further as he continued his studies, ultimately bridging the hallucinations of some of his patients with archetypal themes. His work at the Burkholtzli was instrumental in his conceptualization of the collective unconscious, as we all know, one of the foundational concepts of his work. And as I mentioned earlier, a prototypical example of this development in Jung's thinking arose through his work with a schizophrenic patient known as the solar phallus man. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and read you from the book about the solar phallus man, because if you haven't heard this story before, then you can add this to your repertoire, and if you've heard it, then you can hear it again. So I hope you'll indulge me here. From page 59 in the book. A prototypical example of this development in Jung's thinking arose through his work with a schizophrenic patient known as the solar phallus man. In 1906, one of his patients at the hospital had been diagnosed as an incurable paranoid schizophrenic. This man was uneducated and at times very disturbed, but during quiet periods, he was able to communicate his visions and ideas to the doctors. One day, Jung discovered him standing by the window, moving his head from one side to the other and blinking into the sun. The patient brought Jung to the window and entreated him to do the same, as then he would see something interesting. Jung asked what the man was seeing, and the man responded, "Surely, doctor, you will see the tail of the sun's penis. When I move my head to and fro, it moves too, and that is where the wind comes from." At the time, Jung knew nothing of mythology or archaeology. The encounter puzzled him, but he made note of it. About 4 years later, in 1910, when Jung was engrossed in mythological studies, he discovered the well-known philologist Albrecht Dietrich's a Mithras liturgy in which he recognized the delusional material of his former patient. This book from a famous Paris library published a Greek papyrus dealing with a Mithraic ritual for the first time. The relevant passages Jung excerpted read as follows. Draw breath from the rays, draw in 3 times as strongly as you can, and you will seem to be in the middle of the aerial region. The path of the visible gods will appear through the disk of the sun, who is God my Father. Likewise, there will be seen the so-called tube, the origin of the ministering wind. For you will see hanging down from the disk of the sun something that looks like a tube. And toward the region westward, it is as though there were an infinite east wind. But if the other winds should prevail toward the regions of the east, in like fashion, you'll see the vision veering in that direction. So this striking similarity between the hallucination of his patient and this Mithraic liturgy prompted Jung to investigate further, which led to his discovery of many parallels between motifs in the mythologies of various ethnic groups and the visions and dreams of people who had never heard of them. This led him to conclude that there are myth-forming structural elements in the unconscious. This realization was instrumental to his understanding of the collective unconscious and the archetypes. It also suggests that this kind of autonomous expression of the psyche is involved in producing the hallucinations and delusions of schizophrenia. Jung's discovery that this man's psychotic fantasy was in fact a myth was monumental. This raised it to a meaningful story instead of just a madman's delusion to be dismissed, ignored, feared, or medicated away. This discovery and Jung's attitude about it, in a sense, humanized psychosis. At least ideologically, such a discovery had the potential to impact prevailing emotional responses to schizophrenia, which is the terrain of the Schizophrenia Complex. Jung's observations suggested that while we may perceive people with schizophrenia as different in kind, they are but different in degree. He later profoundly expressed his unique capacity to relate to his own irrational interiority in the Red Book. Universally, we human beings are myth-making creatures. Also bridging from the word association studies in the early 1900s, Jung determined that effective treatment for schizophrenia needed to incorporate, even emphasize a restoration and strengthening of the ego to bracket and organize the unconscious contents that are constellated in schizophrenia. And if we think about it for a minute, if you believe that schizophrenia is a form of dementia, you're not likely to try to do therapy with them to strengthen their ego. So this was a meaningful development. Jung wrote, the complex has an abnormal autonomy and hysteria and tendency to an active separate existence, which reduces and replaces the constellating power of the ego complex. I know it says hysteria, but that was the term of the time, and it's very relevant to, you could substitute schizophrenia in there and the sentence would make a lot of sense. And here we see Edinger's illustration again, which once again talks about the relationship between the ego and the self or the unconscious. The illustration on the far left would be someone in a psychosis. I talk a little bit about theories about schizophrenia in the book, but as I mentioned at the very beginning, when I'm talking about that stuff, I am talking about it as context, and it's easy to get caught up in the enormous volume of material in this regard. That is not my intent. I am not positing a theory about schizophrenia. We are talking about the schizophrenia complex in this new way, but the theories are relevant. So just a nod to them and full respect to the great breadth of research in this area. But as I said, context. So Kraepelin talked about the idea of dementia praecox, that literal translation gives you an idea about where the thinking was and the attitude. Now, Bleuler, schizophrenia, he did come up with that term, which was about a split mind, the splitting of a psychic as opposed to neurological functioning. But you can see where there's sort of a development there. And then Jung's attitude took it a step further. Ego psychology, which was the school of psychoanalysis rooted in Freud's structural id, ego, superego model of the mind, had a lot of implications regarding the cause of schizophrenia, or what was believed to be the cause, that were devastating for schizophrenic children and families, because the attribution was that psychosis was a response to parental failure, that the genesis of schizophrenia is an emotional and psychological defense response, and that some of you may remember that term, the refrigerator mother. It was the idea that if a mother is so cold that it's going to result in the child having schizophrenia. I think this was probably the prevailing attitude that affected my mother's family. It was, I don't exactly know what the timing was, but certainly the shame associated with having a family member with schizophrenia was in the field of her experience generations ago. Now, Laing and Perry represent a refreshingly stark contrast to the normal medical model of the definition of schizophrenia at the time when they were practicing. You can see the years there from 1927 to 89 was Laing, who was a Scottish psychiatrist, and then Perry from 1914 to 98, Jungian analyst and psychiatrist. And they basically saw a schizophrenic experience as having meaning and possibilities for a transcendental kind of experience. I'm going to read a little from these two because they're so interesting. Laing's view, and this is from 1967, on the causes and treatment of psychopathological phenomena were influenced by a study of existential philosophy and ran absolutely counter to the chemical and electroshock methods that had become standard practice. He argued that insanity could be a creative and adaptive response to the world, and developed the theory that mental illness was actually an escape mechanism that allowed individuals to free themselves from intolerable circumstances, primarily emotional and psychological. What one experiences as intolerable emotionally and psychologically is a subjective reality, not always evident from the outside. By way of illustration, at the point of my son's departure, despite his seemingly more than tolerable lifestyle, he still experienced it as an intolerable state of unrest. His leaving for Venice Beach was a literal and symbolic gesture of this truth, his subjective, inarguable truth, regardless of how anyone from the outside may have perceived his circumstances. Perceiving the expressed feelings of the individual patient as valid descriptions of their lived experience rather than as symptoms of mental illness, Laing regarded schizophrenia as a theory rather than a fact. He was considered a rebel in the field of psychiatry. Perhaps he brought fitting, even necessary, polar opposite attitude to the prevailing condemning cultural response to mental illness. He wrote, "If the human race survives, future men will, I suspect, look back on our enlightened epoch as a veritable age of darkness. They will see that what was considered schizophrenic was one of the forms in which, often through quite ordinary people, the light began to break into our all too closed minds." So you can see how different he was from his colleagues. Perry was known as a radical thinker in mental health. He believed schizophrenia had benefits and that the psychotic state could lead to higher consciousness if allowed to run its course. He conceptualized mental syndrome that, though customarily regarded as acute psychosis is actually a natural effort of the psyche to mend its imbalances. Consequently, according to Perry, if the upset is received in the spirit of empathy and understanding and allowed to course, an acute episode can be found to reveal a self-organizing process that has healing potential. Jungians might call this an example of the self-regulation of the psyche, a function in waking life analogous to dreams. Perry noted the function of mythic themes, rituals of antiquity, and the visionary experiences undergone by prophets and social reformers in various ages and parts of the world as representative of this mysterious phenomenon and relevant to understanding it. A common denominator in all this theorizing about schizophrenia is our deep human need to solve essentially insoluble mysteries, or at least agree about a meaning. When such efforts fail, unwanted emotions can be triggered and a complex likely ensues. Part of the revulsion and avoidance that surrounds schizophrenia is the archetypal frustration constellated by our inability fully to understand or to solve it. An encounter with schizophrenia reminds us of our ultimate humility before the unconscious, that great sea that rumbles always beneath our neat lives and sometimes not so neat. I talk a bit about both alchemy and about mythology in the book, and I'm just going to let you know that I do discuss that. If you're interested, I welcome you to take a look at it. Certainly, there are many examples of the dynamic involved in schizophrenia, but the idea of an ego flooded by the unconscious and the idea of our emotional responses to that phenomenon as reflecting our own fear of the unconscious. Those are the two things I'm hoping most that you'll take with you from this, and that it may open you to question if you have some automatic responses to what we call schizophrenia. So I'm reminding you of all that we don't know.
Eve, I know that there are many of us who have questions about your book, so yeah. I hope we can leave some time for that.
Yeah, let's just, I do talk about medication. I realize that's a big component here. I talk a little bit about therapy. And I certainly refer back to Jung and his references to the archetypes of the collective unconscious in schizophrenia.
Right. Yeah, by you going through these slides, then anyone who's looking at this on YouTube will be able to stop the video and see this additional information.
Sure. I just, if you'll bear with me, I want to share this one and then kind of jump ahead to a conclusion, if that's okay.
Great, that'll be perfect.
So individuals with schizophrenia, what we call schizophrenia, are vastly different from each other. They're potentially influenced by or identified with archetypes that are as different as everything else about their personalities and lives, just as is true for those who are not psychotic. Others impacted by those individuals, whether they're family members or clients or strangers, may develop their own complexes in response and are influenced by archetypes that represent their unique experiences with such an encounter. There is no one universal theme that characterizes the individual experience of schizophrenia, other than the undoing of whatever you thought your life story was before you encountered that chaos, either within yourself or in someone you love. This is a wonderful quote, I think, from Jung that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, about with God. To this day, God is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of my life, for better or for worse. And I am going to read just a little bit from the book. Part of depotentiating the schizophrenia complex is recognizing that we just have to bear life's twists and turns, sometimes without understanding, without knowing the reason why. Facing schizophrenia invokes all that we do not know and cannot explain, for which we have no sure cause or cure. Heroic tenacity in the face of the unknowable, even the intolerable, is a broader archetypal theme interwoven with the story of our lives. Maybe our encounters with schizophrenia and its associated complexes represent an essential truth. Life is what it is, not what we want, need, or hope it will be. Yet the sometimes hidden gold of our tattered existence may lie in the very worst challenges we face. In a letter written days before his death in 1961, Jung made this comment about God. What we call schizophrenia represents an immersion of ego consciousness into the deep pool of the unconscious. If the schizophrenia complex is generated by our panic about all we cannot control or understand, perhaps the potential for healing lies in submitting to the will of that divine tumult to which Jung refers, realizing the potential for individuation therein. In the face of devastating upset in our inevitable encounters with those swipes of fate that cross us violently and recklessly, finding enough gold to persevere is ultimately a matter of faith, perspective, and attitude. Jung's quote suggests that such seemingly arbitrary, mysterious, and upsetting circumstances also express the divine, requiring us to withstand the opposites inherent in our human existence. Eros, the archetypal capacity for relatedness, is also part of our divine inheritance, even necessary and perhaps most when logic fails. In the end, in some fundamental way, if we are to survive, it is Eros who can tip the scales, heal a wounded family tree, a dead dream, a broken heart. In Greek mythology, the god Eros is the personification of love and relatedness, a cosmogonic force of nature. Psychologically, Eros holds the function of relationship. Love is what makes a parent swim out to the deep after a child who's been caught in the undertow. Eros fuels our devotion and profoundly unreasonable tenacity. Love can overrule fear, shock, and sadness, all the emotional territory of the schizophrenia complex. And I'm going to stop there so we can have plenty of time for. Okay. I can't, you're muted, Skip.
Yep. Wow. That was a lot to take in, but thank you. Thank you very much, Eve, for that wonderful description of your book. And I'm going to bring the gallery in now because we have consistently had about 35 people here, 7 of them on YouTube following along, and the rest here on Zoom. And I want to give the Zoom panel the opportunity to ask what questions they may have. So you can raise your hand. I have John Jackson with his hand raised. So John, why don't you have the first question?
Hi, Dr. Maram. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I was also at the Orange County presentation that you gave.
Oh,
I've been thinking about what you've been saying for several weeks now, ever since that happened. And I think you're really onto something here. It's a real thing. And I'm a physician and a psychiatrist. So I've certainly met a lot of psychotic people in my life. Now, one thing that really impressed me early in my career is I actually went down to Palau for a couple of weeks once, and they paid me to consult down there because the rate of schizophrenia is double what it is anywhere else in the world, like 4 to 6% of the population. And they took me out. I think they were testing me, but they took me out on a boat to a little island to this community where there was this older man who was, I'm not exaggerating, probably the most psychotic man I have ever met. And I mean, talking to him was a deep dive into another reality. And he was fully integrated into village life. Yeah. He didn't want treatment. They didn't want treatment. Right. Everything was fine. and it was so fascinating to see that. And there were other members in the community that had physical disabilities that were totally accommodated for and whatnot. It was just fascinating to see a culture like that. And I've always carried that with me.
Mhm.
I've always stopped too, and I'm thinking about what you're saying about the schizophrenia complex, which I think is true out, well, for us, but also in the general population. But where have I seen other things like this that have affected me in that same way? There's a whole bunch, but there's a couple that I wanted to mention. One is when I was still in medical school at Loma Linda, they took us one day, we all went out, I think they put us on a bus, and we went out to this place, I can't even tell you where. We went into this room, and it was this large medical room with 30 or 40 kids of various ages that had hydrocephalus. And some with heads unimaginably large, and obviously these kids were never going to be integrated into family or society, it was so hard to take that in. And assimilate that. And another experience like that was when I was in my psychiatric training. I remember going into kind of a standard old style state hospital and seeing some human beings that really were and will never be anything other than dangerous, aggressive, wild animals, and nothing more than that. And that's it. And really, these things are very unsettling. I mean, what are we as human beings? Don't we have some status? Isn't there some guiding principle? Aren't we special? Something we can count on? But those things, those other things that I just mentioned, we can still lock those away. And we don't do that with schizophrenia anymore. And it's with us, and we have to learn to live with this. And I really appreciate the work you're doing. I think it's really good and really important. So thank you.
And thank you for sharing those stories. I think your perception, that story about your being in Palau and what you're talking about, and that's fascinating, isn't it? And they were, because of their attitude.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what are we talking about? Treatment? They don't need treatment. It has to do with whether an individual with whatever symptoms you're describing, whether it's medical kind or this kind, how do we respond to it? Do we have a place for it? Can we include it? And if we can, then where's the problem? So thank you for sharing that. Wonderful.
One other thing I'll say, which after 30 some years of talking with psychotic patients on a fairly regular, because I was a prescriber as well as a therapist, and I realized I really liked some of these schizophrenic patients. And I thought about it over 30 years. I think schizophrenics are not able to tell lies. They're not able to misrepresent themselves the way that your typically neurotic patient will come and tell a story that you have to figure out the truth. It's interesting. It's a curse in a way, and yet it's fascinating in another way.
Sure. Well,
thank you.
Sure. The lie is different from a delusion.
That's right.
I'm the king of Siam, but for them, that represents a subjective reality. It's not a deliberate intent to,
Jung talks about the reality of the psyche. It's real.
That's right. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
So other questions in the group? I can't see you all on one screen, so please use the raise hand function on Zoom. And Diane, I believe you're interested in the question.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm wondering what kind of, other than medication and the support of a loving family, what kind of therapy was your son able to receive to help him? Was it something to help build his ego strength?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, I think it's so wonderful that we're discussing this in the context of a realization that these individuals are all different from each other. There are some things that are similar, but they're all different, just as we all are from each other. And in my son's case, the other characteristics that he had, he is good with people. He's shy. He's an introvert. I wouldn't say shy. He's an introvert. It mattered to him that whoever he talked to was kind and accepting, and that was the main thing. If he felt like he was being judged, or if he was being given directions about what to do, then he put up a barrier. And I actually have some, I don't have them at my fingertips, but there are some quotes from him in response to that question, which would be probably a better answer than what I'm doing. But I mean, to paraphrase what he said, it would need to be, therapy needed to be with somebody who was genuinely kind and caring and accepting of his reality. And we did find, there were some therapists. It was a compilation of different things, and as I think it always is, and medication was necessary in order to help him to ground, to recover his affect, to navigate using his ego enough to be part of our culture. So because part of what we're dealing with when we're trying to help someone with schizophrenia integrate into our community, of course, has to do with the collective reality. How, people's the reality of attitudes, the reality that there is such a dearth of resources out there, that there is so much stigma associated with the condition, very unlike Palau. So what we're helping them do is not just to mitigate the symptoms, but it's a combination of mitigating the symptoms to where you can behave in a way that is going to help you to fit into our world as you're going to have to encounter it. So yeah, medication, family, and love, and I think love first and foremost. But yes, therapy after he was able to stabilize enough.
Was therapy helpful?
Yeah, I think so, for sure. Someone to talk to. So Jung talks about therapy. Oh, I'm dying to read you this quote, and I can't find it offhand. Well, he talks about the meaning of therapy in terms of breaking the isolation that someone who is in a psychotic state suffers. That just being seen, sitting with someone who is sort of on the other side, not sharing their subjective experience, which they have come to realize is very isolated, but reaching a hand across and saying, okay, I'm right here with you.
At our hospital, we set up a program for schizophrenic patients to come in and learn social skills. And at the bus stop, you don't start a conversation by saying I'm schizophrenic.
Right.
You learn to do shallow talk.
Filter.
Yeah, that was really important.
Yeah, Jewel has her hand up, so Jewel, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I feel that I'm not an emotional person most of the time, but you have touched my heart.
Oh,
You've made me understand my family.
Oh.
You've made me understand myself and the journey I'm going through in life. And one of the sayings that you quoted from Carl Jung, the silent facts with help from our family. Wow.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, but the phrase that you used that was new to me, and I think with your bringing it to life, I do think there is a new road that you're paving for us personally. And when you talk more about feeling tones, it's your turn to talk.
Thank you. That touches my heart too. Thank you for sharing that, Jewel.
Okay, James has a comment or question up. James Blaylock, please.
Yes, this was awesome. I knew very little about schizophrenia, even though I've been studying Jung for several years now. But one thing that touched me was when you were saying when someone comes down or you're someone with schizophrenia, there is this isolation they feel from their community, and there is a fear they don't fit in, and that makes it worse. I think you were implying that, much worse. And what I did read about schizophrenia in some older tribal cultures, they would, if someone came down with schizophrenia, it wasn't the person that was sick, it was the tribe that was sick, and they would all conjoin together for the healing.
Yeah.
And so when you were saying it's, if we see someone that's having this type of a breakdown, instead of shunning them
Right.
across the street, is making them feel more welcome. And not that that would cure it, it would seem to me, but it would help it. Is that what you're implying?
How beautifully stated. Thank you. I'm so glad that you drew that from what we've been talking about here today. I mean, absolutely. I mean, back to Palau. I mean, a lot of it is attitude, and yeah. Thank
And
you.
one thing I just wanted to add is you, Skip, you mentioned A Dangerous Method, the book. When I
Yes.
was
The film,
studying
yeah.
Jung, required viewing was, it was called My Name Was Sabina Spielrein. It's a documentary. And I think it's still on Netflix. I'm not sure, but I have you can still get the disc on Amazon, but it's the same subject, same person, but more of a documentary. It's fascinating, and it speaks
Right.
to what you're talking about.
And there's another movie that is on YouTube in 6 parts called The Soul Keeper. And
Yes, I saw that. I want to see that again, but I can't find it. It's on YouTube.
it's on YouTube, and it's called The Soul Keeper, and it's in 6 15-minute segments.
Thank you.
Yeah. Philippe.
Thank you, Eve, for I'm looking forward to reading your book, but I enjoyed a lot the presentation, and for you, your courage and your son's courage to speak up to that. I'm one of 6 siblings. 2 of us diagnosed schizophrenic, and 2 I'm not, but two others, and having having needed hospitalization. More than once. Anyway, and then Diane triggered my comment here, because she mentioned, Diane, you mentioned strengthening, what kind of therapies have been, what helps, and you mentioned helping the ego, strengthening the ego. And I've been in Jungian therapy since 1997. I unraveled and started Jungian therapy by chance. But the first 20 years, all that it was building up my ego. I was 37, and my ego was so weak. You wouldn't know from outside. I had achieved a lot, but Edinger talks about you can do no Jungian therapy without a strong enough ego. But you can do what you do is building up the ego.
Right.
Yeah, and then now I do more. Thank you very much for bringing that up to the. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for your comments, Philippe, and for sharing that.
Yeah. Jordan next.
Yes, Eve, thank you so much. What a humanizing, destigmatizing, and informative, insightful presentation. I know when homeless people near me, when I'm out working, I work outdoors on a plaza, and when there's someone talking to themselves incessantly, I walk up and, pardon interrupting your conversation, as if there are 3 people there. When you have an opportunity, can I ask you a question? And it's always, would you like a bottle of water or a cup of coffee? But I haven't until you had doing this presentation, and then Dr. John Jackson talking about Palau. And it really opened up the nothing influences children more than the silent facts in the background, where, the Van Cliburn, I played the space between the notes. And then the not knowing or unknown is a friend of curiosity and wonderment. And children have that in that childlike state. And I wonder if from your perspective in schizophrenia, is there more of that childlike, not childish, childlike condition of structure without the stigmatizing stricture of society that allows them to be actually more connected, so that when their discernment via ego strength comes up, that becomes a more experienced and whole person, as if that kind of, does that even put that in a question? Just the
Well,
connected of comfortability with the not knowing.
If from what I'm hearing from what you said, and there was a lot there, but there are different kinds of manifestations of what we call schizophrenia, one of which is characteristically that sort of childlike style, but they're not all like that. And even with the childlike style, the significant part is that the person's, as we've been talking about with the ego, their subjective experience is by definition somewhat isolated. And I think when you did what you did with, or do what you do with the homeless individuals that are talking to themselves, you're basically using the same approach that Jung refers to as being absolutely potentially transformative in therapy, which is that you are just accepting them. It's like Palau, and so we've always got, there are these two layers of the experience of what we call schizophrenia, one of which is the symptoms themselves. The person is really imagine if you were dreaming and you couldn't wake up, so there's that, but then there's this other layer of people crossing the street to get away from you, of looking at you cross-eyed when you are conscious enough of how they're responding to you. Talk about the pain of isolation and judgment. And so you don't do that. And so when you come and you approach that man and you're just taking him at face value for his accepting his subjective experience, you're bringing Palau to, I'll use that metaphorically, to that setting. What a difference. Our response to schizophrenia, a big point that I care about in the book, it does reflect our response to our own madness, to our own relationship with the unconscious. And that's a cultural thing. I know I haven't talked as much about the collective as Skip would like right now, but it's in the book, and you can draw the links that, as a culture, we don't accept, we don't tolerate, we are avoidant and repulsed by, the unconscious within ourselves, everywhere, things that don't make sense, things we can't control, things we don't, can't manage. And so when you behave differently, I bet that the homeless guy perks up and says, sure, I'll have a bottle of water.
Well, yeah, I so appreciate your presentation. Just from now, I don't feel so Pollyanna, oversimplifying to, I'm going to treat them like people too. There's a whole load of responses. I mean, affect regulation is one that they don't have, but there's a whole load of responses of content you've given me that instead of just me saying, well, I'm going to treat them like people, and sometimes not, because if you engage them, that's lighting the dynamite. I mean, you just have to tell by the eyes, but I appreciate your presentation, especially for that, because it gives me more psychological tool avenues to understand these, actually the structureless, the structure without stricture, instead of just saying, I'm not going to stigmatize. So you've opened that up a lot for me. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So Jewel has her hand up, but I'm going to exercise a prerogative of the chair for a few minutes here and raise my questions. And Jewel's already had one opportunity, so we'll come back to her at the end. But it's been my observation over many years, probably 30 years or more, that there's a significant application of Jungian psychology generally to the collective. And as I read your book, it reminded me of a lot of things. And one of them was that we have lots of different collectives in our humanness around the world, and at all kinds of levels, from family level through local societies and governments, etc. And they get to the point of being very opposite. And so when the January 6th event occurred, many of us couldn't even relate to it. We said, how could this be even happening in our society? And it struck me as a kind of eruption of a kind of madness that is in the sub-level of our collective. And I wonder if you'd speak to those issues a little bit.
Well, there's a lot there. I think you brought up the example of this eruption. I think that's a great word to describe what happened at a collective level with the January 6th. January 6th was one incident in a story that had been unfolding for quite some time, which basically I think could be described as, the eruption of the shadow, the underbelly of the collective culture of this country, as we have imaged ourselves, and this is not, it's not like something new crawled out of the woodwork. It's been there all along, and we have not wanted to recognize it or recognize our differences, and there has not really been a dialogue. And so just like with any other unconscious contents that we try to tuck away and not pay attention to, they come up to bite us. They're not going to go away. In fact, the more we try to avoid them, the more likely it is you're going to have an eruption. So I think that is what happened. And I do see, in the latest issue of Psychological Perspectives, I think it's Naomi Lewinsky, you might want to take a look at that, because in the beginning of it, she's writing about chaos in terms of how that's manifesting in our collective culture. And I saw that word, thought, that's interesting, because it connects not only to, what we've been talking about here today, as chaos as a sort of archetype of schizophrenia, what we call schizophrenia, we could say that, but also that archetype is rearing its head in it isn't just our country, we know that, it's the world.
Yeah, it's in the humanity itself.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to draw the listeners' attention to this book, which is called Psychic Energy by Esther Harding. It's an old book, but it is really a remarkable book, as you can see from my tabs in it. And the first paragraph of it really addresses the issues that we've been talking about. So I want to read that first paragraph now. It's in the introduction to the book on page 3. The book's called Psychic Energy, its transformation its source and its transformation. And of course, psychic energy was a central theme of Jung's work throughout his career. But here's what Esther Harding says. Beneath the decent facade of consciousness, with its disciplined moral order and its good intentions, lurk the crude instinctive forces of life, like monsters of the deep, devouring, begetting, warring endlessly. They are for the most part unseen, and yet on their urge and energy, life itself depends. Without them, living beings would be as inert as stones. But were they left to function unchecked, life would lose its meaning, being reduced once more to mere birth and death, as in the teeming world of the primordial swamps. In creating civilization, man sought, however unconsciously, to curb these natural forces and to channel some part of it, at least of their energy, into forms that would serve a different purpose. For with the coming of consciousness, cultural and psychological values began to compete with the purely biological aims of unconscious functioning. So that's what Esther Harding said to begin her book. And I think we're all, I beg your pardon?
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, and the book was published in 1949, but it's really worth a read for those who haven't read. Okay, Jewel, go ahead, ask your question.
This was to finish up when I could not finish saying earlier when I got overwhelmed. You were talking in regards to your book on page 21 and 23. You used the phrase feeling tones. Could you tell me how you came up with that and how you apply those?
Well, I can't take credit.
Okay.
That was Jung actually used that expression. A feeling toned complex, for example, would be a complex carrying the primary characteristics of affect, that it is experienced and defined by feeling. In other words, it's not like a mental or a thinking kind of a torment. It's a feeling one. Like when you, we all,
Emotional,
pardon?
emotional, like you said, versus neurological, mental.
Emotional, absolutely. Yes, that's right. That's right. And see, and that's one of the distinctions, like when between the way he talks about schizophrenia complexes and the way he usually does, is that he doesn't talk about the schizophrenia complex as a feeling focused or texture. It's not about feelings. He talks about the schizophrenia complex as being completely cut off, like compartmentalized and disconnected. Whereas a feeling tone complex is like you lose the boundaries between the emotional experience and your realistic perception of what's going on. Like if we meet somebody and they remind us of our mom and we suddenly, feel flooded with anxiety and, or whatever. Does that make sense?
It does, because when I mentioned something about family, it reminded me of an individual within the family that identified just what you were talking about, that they were having a feeling, but that emotionally removed them from the family, which protected them, but also harmed them because it was the baby of the family.
Oh.
That pulled it all back together about what you're saying. So can you emphasize then how you are different than Carl Jung's philosophy?
Well, he talks about a schizophrenia complex basically as schizophrenia itself, like schizophrenia itself, the condition of schizophrenia itself as a complex. Okay. And then he talks about the kinds of complexes that neurotic or quote unquote normal people have as being essentially feeling toned. He doesn't talk about the feeling response that we have to what we call schizophrenia in terms of a schizophrenia complex. He doesn't do that. So in other words, according to Jung, a person who has schizophrenia couldn't have a schizophrenia complex that is feeling toned because they're so cut off from their affect. It's different. Like a person with schizophrenia would have to sort of get enough ego, as we've been talking about, and would have to recover their lost affect, like in that quote from my son, to where they then have an emotional response to the way, say, people are treating them, or the fact that they can tell now that they've been behaving bizarrely.
Got it.
Yeah.
You did well.
Thank you.
Did well. Thank you very much. Okay.
All right, we're okay, Judith. Let's hear your question. You need to unmute, Judith.
Mine isn't a question, it's a comment. I was a United Methodist pastor for 37 years, and churches are a place in our society where people who are mentally ill gather. And so I would say probably most of the days of my entire ministry, And I worked with people, and plus I had a special clinical pastoral education experience working with people who were psychotic. But I don't have the feeling that ordinary society is as afraid because of my experience in the church, because I felt like such human beings all around us were welcomed into the service of worship, even when they were disruptive. I felt like people would go out of the way. Like, for instance, when I say disruptive, I mean going up and taking money out of the collection plate and things like that. I felt like people were very kind and surrounded the persons and fought fiercely to continue to be one of the places in society that welcomed homeless and just all kinds of persons, people who were out of the criminal justice system and things like that. So I just wanted to make that comment, because my experience is not one of great fear and shunning and walking across the street, but walking across the street to greet the person. We want to be sure that places like that in society are also lifted up.
That's wonderful. And they're few and far between. And thank you for what you do and have done. I mean, it's like there are pockets of Palau among us.
Absolutely. So Diane, you wanted to ask another question.
Yeah, I'm trying to clarify in my mind whether or not schizophrenia is considered generally to be genetic, purely genetic.
Well, there's research that suggests it is, and there's research that suggests it's not, at least in terms of purely. It seems evident that there is a genetic component. Exactly how much so, we don't know. And one of the reasons it's so difficult to make that kind of definitive statement is that there are so many different characteristics involved in how this phenomenon manifests in any particular individual that make a ton of difference. So you could have somebody who's extroverted and generally in a good mood and has a gene that gives them a propensity for a schizophrenic experience, and maybe because of their environment, they don't end up having such an experience. And then you can have somebody who's maybe paranoid and depressed and also has an anxiety disorder and has, like leans towards isolation, and they have a gene which gives them the propensity, and given the right set of environmental factors, there you go, they're going to have that experience. So it's unwieldy. So that doesn't really answer your question. We'd love to be able to say there's definitely, that's the main thing. We don't have that kind of evidence. Just that it's likely that it's a component.
Yeah, because we're so individual, I guess, you can't really just diagnose an individual with exactly, you can't pigeonhole it, I guess, like any other mental illness. For example, there's schizoaffective disorder. Is that even on the same spectrum as schizophrenia?
Schizoaffective disorder is, and with all due respect, it's kind of, it's a term we came up with that's might be kind of schizophrenia light. It means that you've got schizophrenia, but hey, it's also a mood disorder. So for a part of the time, you're going to be manifesting psychosis, but for a part of the time, you're going to have something that's a little more socially acceptable, like depression or anxiety or both. And I'm not saying that to minimize at all. I'm just saying that it has to do with, I suspect that was made into its own category in part reflecting a bit of schizophrenia complex that we people, especially if they have somebody in the family who's diagnosed with schizophrenia, might try and get the diagnosis to be morphed into, schizoaffective because it sounds slightly less ominous. Back to Schwartz-Salant's book, and it's a lovely book, Mental Health Nurse, and say that word aloud and see how it feels. So, but that's my 2 cents, and yes, it's on the same spectrum as the other psychotic disorders.
I have one.
Thank you so very much, because it's so important to raise consciousness about mental illness. So thank you for your work. Thank you.
Eve, I want to just ask you one specific question. In a case where there is known schizophrenia on both sides of a family, in the case of an engagement, there's a known schizophrenia on both sides of the groom's family, and the groom himself has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Do you feel that it's the responsible thing to do or do you think it's required that be disclosed to the bride? Do you think it's required that that an actual diagnosed schizophrenia should be disclosed to the bride?
Well, my subjective response, which is probably flavored by clinical experience, but is not exclusively that, would be that the issue there would be more about being as honest and transparent about as much of oneself as one could with one's intended marriage partner, rather than, because it's this particular diagnosis, are you somehow required? You wouldn't be required, but if I was either of those people, I would see that as maybe an important gesture to affirm the intimacy between them. I would say it's more in that category. Then if you know what you're dealing with, and frankly, if he's feeling like he's got something to hide because he's got that in his family, then that could affect the emotional field, their shared field. It's unstated, it's in the background. And if she doesn't know, but he knows, how wouldn't she want to know? And how wouldn't he want to know what her response was? Is that going to cause her to reject him? So I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. That's fair. That's fair enough. I don't want to put you in a complex position beyond that.
No, it sounds like one of those things where the truth will out and you just get to choose how.
Penelope had a question.
Okay, Penelope, go.
Yeah, I did. I was wondering, actually, I've been listening to Labyrinth, but Catherine Clay on, they were talking about the numbers on Emma Jung. It was very interesting. It's very interesting. And the numbers that you brought up with the words and the responses with the timer, that's very interesting. And I wondered, what would you consider being ego strengthening? The reason I ask, I'm studying clinical hypnosis at the moment, and part of that is ego strengthening under hypnosis, part of what I'm learning. But I wondered, from your perspective on schizophrenia, what you would say ego strengthening is.
Well, it's really basically the same with schizophrenia as it is with anything else. The ego is what helps us navigate the world, obviously. It's like, ego consciousness is kind of the opposite of the unconscious. And so if we're working on ego strengthening, it means we're working on our adapting to, making good decisions about, and taking care of ourselves in the real world.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
That's good. I'm hearing that from you. Thank you. Thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, Eve, we've completed 2 hours here, and I don't want to keep you longer than you're willing to speak. I don't know if there's any other questions in the room, but I certainly appreciate you being here. We've had, just for your information, we've had 28 people consistently on the YouTube, or I'm sorry, on the Zoom panel, and 7 consistently on YouTube throughout. So we've had 35 people present. I have not gone into the YouTube questions, which really seem to be more personally related than your discussion here. But we very much appreciate you being here talking to us today. And is there anything you want to say to wrap up our discussion?
Just that I really, really appreciate all of you joining me and allowing me to join you. And the response to this book has been heartwarming and surprising to me. As I said, it was hard to write. It's still hard to talk about. And your response encourages me that it was worth it. And so I really appreciate all of you very much. Thank you for having me.
Yes, it was assuredly worth it, and it is published by Chiron Publications, who encouraged me to invite Eve to this event. So thank you all for being here. And Judith says, what a wonderful and illuminating book, and your passion and kindness is so evident. So anyway, thank you everyone for being here, and we'll see you next time. I'm sorry we didn't get more of the YouTube discussion into it, but I think it's quite good as it is. So bye-bye until next time.